Good afternoon, everyone. A warm welcome to all of you on behalf of WRI India, ICC, and TRI. Today's session will bring together insights from two leaders shaping India's environmental and climate future. I'm delighted to introduce Mr. Madhav Pai, CEO of WRI India, an organization at the forefront of research and action across food, land, water, climate, cities, and energy. And our distinguished guest, Mr. B.V.R. Subrahmanyam, CEO, NITI Aayog, with an illustrious career across the IAS, key leadership roles in Chhattisgarh and Jammu and Kashmir, 2 terms in the Prime Minister's office, and significant experience at the World Bank. He now leads NITI Aayog's green growth and climate strategy at the national level. Please join me in welcoming Madhav and Mr. Subrahmanyam to the stage.
Good afternoon, everyone. So we have a very exciting post-lunch conversation. We'll make sure you guys stay awake. I think, thank you very much, Mr. Subrahmanyam, for joining us for this conversation. This is a conversation about accelerating India's restoration economy. To just start, we have an exhibition in the back, which really highlights organizations, both businesses, NGOs that have been, these successful organizations that have been created, building on the restoration economy. And for me, this is such it's such an opportunity that India has to really drive this economy and to really make. So one of the sort of main reasons of doing this event was to highlight all of these excellent work that is going on, highlight these organizations that are really building this kind of ecosystem. And then, of course, there's organizations building on value chain, there's agroforestry, there's tech being built around that, very good models of community action, etc. So one was to highlight that, and then to really see how we can really then bring finance to this problem in a big way, how we can also align policies, etc., for us to drive this at a scale. So I know you've been very much a part of the Viksit Bharat visioning agenda. So really how and where do you see a role for an opportunity like this in the larger context? I think that's something we'd love to hear.
So, thanks Madhav for inviting me, and he's been chasing me for a while to come here because this is a new topic. This is something which you normally don't pay attention to. It's seen probably as a side activity by largely companies which are in the mining sector to some extent. So I've actually seen Ministry of Coal, Ministry of Mines, NMDC. They pay a lot of attention to this, and I think the Honorable Prime Minister has also been giving a lot of priority and attention to this. And I've also seen work of WRI in some of these micro areas where they've actually done excellent work in restoration. So there's 2 ways to look at it. Okay, one is Viksit Bharat. So we have a goal to become a developed economy by 2047, which is to take our per capita income to a developed economy level, which will obviously translate into an aggregate size of the economy, which will be quite large. Okay, we're talking about $18,000 per capita per annum and $30 trillion GDP. So if you look at India, it's about, broadly about 100 million hectares of India is wasteland, 95, 98. We can decide how to define it. That's almost 1/3, 30% of India is wasteland. And that has a cost on the economy, right? And the cost on the economy is anywhere between 2 to 3% per annum is the cost to the economy in terms of GDP loss. Just look at it the other way. We are growing at about 7% right now, and we had really jolly good figures last Friday when the quarterly results came out on the economy. By MOSPI, we grew at 8.2%, and the first half of this year has been good. So we will do pretty well, certainly more than 7%. But to become Viksit Bharat, we should be going around 8%. So where do you get the additional impetus for the GDP to come from? One is, of course, improving efficiency, doing more reforms, doing a lot of other things which can actually improve the productivity of the economy. The other side of way of doing it is cutting out wastage and cutting out other areas which are a drag on the economy. And I would put it that land degradation, soil degradation, and degradation of our resources is also a drag on the economy. So if you actually cut down this degradation, which is causing a 3% loss to GDP per annum, that actually adds 3 percentage points to your GDP growth. We have never even looked at it in that way, you know. We have always looked at it as some kind of a mitigation exercise. How do we prevent, you know, we have always looked at it from ecological, environmental terms. But I'm giving a straight GDP. If you actually want to leap from the current growth rate and raise it by about 1% or 1.5%, this can be as impactful as any number of reforms and other things that you're doing. After all, that's what you're expecting there, a bump up to your GDP growth. So if you actually do restoration of your entire land and water ecosystem, you can actually add 2 to 3% to your GDP growth, which puts you on the trajectory to becoming a developed economy. So that's one way of looking at it in terms of Vikasit Bharat, how the restoration economy can drive that. Of course, then when you are adding 2% to an economy, 2% of an economy is quite a large thing. For a country of our size, we've crossed 4 trillion. So it's going to be 2% of that would be about $80 billion. So that's obviously going to have a lot of companies, NGOs, organizations, people, employment and all that. The second way of looking at it is, we have got this huge challenge of addressing climate change. And we've always looked at, mitigation. We forget the other side of the equation is also there, which is adaptation. And between the two is the large role which land and water play as carbon sinks. I mean, after all, if you look at the CO2 equation, we keep forgetting, that there is this huge element. And if you want to actually sequester carbon, one of the ways of sequestering carbon is through, better, whatever the land can take and improving the land's capacity to sequester carbon. So if you do that, obviously, you will be much better off reaching your net zero pathway to 2070, which is our goal for being net zero, without actually affecting your growth rates, etc. Because you're not touching any of the other things that are happening. This will contribute to reducing your net carbon emission. So I think, and we have made some goals, we are making some commitments, but I think we can do faster. So focusing on restoration can help you directly in accelerating GDP growth by cutting down the loss that happens to GDP because of degradation. On the other side, you also meet climate goals, which are also as essential in the long run. But why do we emphasize on climate goals? I mean, if climate is bad, so what? You can always say, because it actually not just affects individuals, it affects the economy, it affects the environment. The entire chain finally ends up in individuals. And what do they earn and how well they live, okay, and the quality of life. So I think from both sides, you can see that restoration can play a key role in Viksit Bharat.
So just, I think building, you talked about sort of the more macro perspective on this. This opportunity does exist, but we also know a lot of it is, small land parcels distributed. Then there is many government schemes that support. So this, last time we met, you mentioned that, you were very much part of the watershed mission in Madhya Pradesh. So based on your experience of actually putting together a mission like that and working closely with it, what would your advice or thought be to a lot of organizations that are working on this, trying to drive convergence of schemes, trying to, aggregate these small pieces of land into meaningful size scale projects that, district collectors or state governments would be interested in?
So, nice you reminded me something about my past. I spent a couple of years, and I was the mission director, actually set it up in Madhya Pradesh, and worked as, trying to push this watershed program there. And of course, subsequently as a district collector, you also had a responsibility to get something done. Some of the things that strike you, I think the watershed guidelines of Government of India, which came out in the early 90s, I think B.N. Yugandhar was there in rural development when that was done, Government had a large number of vertical programs. You had a DPAP program, you had a DDP program, you had a IWDP program, you had a watershed program of the Agriculture Ministry. I mean, all had the same goal. So, in a way, all these programs, without actually being merged, you applied common guidelines which are applicable to all. So, they actually became mutually interchangeable wherever you were. I think that was a brilliant idea at that point in time. And I think that program did make a difference. Wherever states gave it priority at a state level, suddenly it filters down into the system, and you had a lot of good work happening, and not just in Madhya Pradesh, we have seen it in Karnataka, we have seen it in Maharashtra, a lot of things. As a collective, when one actually did it, one actually saw the rejuvenation of large tracts. I worked in one of the water stressed parts of Madhya Pradesh, the western part of Madhya Pradesh, Malwa. Malwa is extremely water stressed, and the tribal areas of Malwa are actually denuded of any. I mean, even the tree stumps have been pulled out for firewood. So then even no growth below. So actually other than grass, nothing will grow. And then the soil loss has ensured in part that other than stones and rubble, nothing is left. There is no topsoil. If you travel over Jhabua, Southern Dhar and all that, there is no topsoil. And these were actually bamboo forests long ago. And that's why the first paper mill, Nepanagar, is there in that part of the country. So there's no bamboo. So today you have a paper mill for which the bamboo is carted from 500 miles away. So that is the problem. You actually can restore things faster. The problem is, I don't think government organizations and departments are structured to do it in an integrated way. Government is very good in silos. Two, the other issue is, a lot of these areas do not have enough non-governmental organizations which are actually far better placed in this kind of work. This is now I'm talking of something 25 years ago, 30 years ago actually. World has changed. You have actually a mushrooming of non-government organizations, think tanks, action agencies, which are now working in the field. And therefore, that can help transform these areas. None of these initiatives, particularly in rural India, will succeed. I'm saying that they will not succeed unless they become a people's movement, until people see a stake in it. So somewhere there have to be benefits that come out of it, and the benefits have to be shared with the people. Otherwise, I've seen people who do phenomenal work for 2-3 years, and that individual who's a catalyst moves out and the whole thing collapses. Then what have we achieved? It's a wastage of time, it's a wastage of money. So I think you need to bring people into the process. And that's where governments are weak. Governments are weak in involving people in mass action. And therefore, I think that's where NGOs, think tanks can play a very, very strong role in getting public involvement, ensuring they can build a stake, particularly through income generating activities. So I have seen Dhar, where I was, Nalcha block, which is where Mandu is actually. I actually went out of the way to invite. The district had 0 NGOs. So I had actually went around, going around Indore, Gandhian organization, asking them to come and settle down in the district. But the settling will not be in the district headquarters, right? They'll have to be in the areas where you have to do work, which will be tribal, remote. So help them, support them, settle down. And then you exit, it doesn't matter, they sustain the work. And I've actually heard increase in water table, improvement in crop, single cropping to multiple cropping. In some areas, forests have actually got restored because of this. Because villagers start understanding that the forests actually improve the water table. I think this kind of a huge communication exercise with the community and involving them is far better done by agencies outside government rather than... Government can play the role of a handholder, but it cannot become the prime mover except in some special circumstances, which are not a good thing because special circumstances are special. They do not last forever. So you will, anybody, all the people who have worked in this sector in the room will know. When the key agent moves on, the whole thing stops. The next person is not interested. So I think that's very, very important. And there have been successes. BAIF in Maharashtra and Gujarat, they have done excellent work, in restoration of that. Across the country, you will find organizations. But why are we not having this impact at the national level? I think that becomes the question. I think, either we do not have large enough numbers of people outside government, or they're not getting enough support from government in terms of, because you need to embrace, the government needs to embrace them. So I think that's one of the things, and I'll throw an open invitation. I mean, NITI is not an implementing organization. However, I run an aspirational districts program. So we cover 112 districts. I run an aspirational block program, which covers 500 blocks, 330 districts. Most of them, 330 districts is half of India out of 700 districts. So we have a direct connect with the district magistrates or collectors there. So if anybody wants to get associated with working in any of these, and the lists are available on the website, and mind you, most of them are backward, tribal, dry, rain-fed. You know, it's Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, interior, it's Jharkhand, it's Orissa, all that kind of northeast. Get associated. We will ensure that you can take off in those districts.
My follow-up question was around that. I mean, how well, and you mentioned that, integrating this into the aspirational districts program, and I think that seems like a very good opportunity. Do you think like a restoration districts idea or something like that at an India level, to a large extent how the green revolution became sort of a movement, and you talked about like connecting to the people. Is there a restoration revolution or a restaurant movement idea that either gets linked to an aspirational districts program kind of idea or something else? Any reflections on that?
So I think it's doable. I'm not saying it's happening, it's doable. So like even take our frontier, our aspirational blocks program. I have 500 blocks in the country. And they're everywhere, east, west, north, south. So unlike aspirational districts, which were 100, it's easier to, 100 is more manageable than 500, no doubt about it. So what we have picked up is, we have picked up groups of blocks. So we have picked up one set of blocks, we're calling them Frontier 50. These are blocks where we are using highly advanced technologies to make an impact on the ground, education, healthcare, nutrition, agriculture, and so on, livelihoods. So that we're calling them Frontier 50, so we've kind of branded them. And here we have found some key actor who can actually get that done. And therefore, the Frontier 50 is about high tech in backward areas. Similarly, we have something called Nevolution. NE stands for Northeast, right? We have picked up 43 blocks in the Northeast. They tend to get ignored, don't get the same attention, and doing something there. Similarly, we have picked up 40 PVTG blocks, the primitive tribes as they call it, particularly vulnerable tribal groups, and giving focused attention to those and doing that. So we can actually start with, say, 10 or so blocks, start working on restoration. If the examples start getting solidified, replicable, scalable, we can pick up 50, 100 blocks where you and others have a footprint, and then brand them, restore 50 or restore 100, and those areas can then pick up wasteland for restoration, improvement, reversing degradation and all that. It can be done. I'd also like to mention another thing. I'd seen something very interesting, extremely interesting in fact, and I leave it to all of you, anybody can want to carry it forward. We have the green hydrogen mission. Green hydrogen is an important area. The government is putting quite a bit of money, 18,000 crores into it. But what's the typical green hydrogen production cycle? Solar energy goes to these hydrolyzers, and you separate water and hydrogen H2O, you take the hydrogen out, and that's green because it has come from green. And that green hydrogen will have multiple uses. It can go into fertilizer as ammonia, it can go into transportation, many uses. Green hydrogen has another route for production. It can be from biofuels or bioeconomy. Okay, it can also. So actually, I've met a person, Mr. Pandit, in Pune, who runs KPIT, and he actually has a demonstration pilot model which is actually working and proving, where you feed grass and other biomass from wasteland. It digests it, and that energy is used to generate green hydrogen. This is an alternate route without going into solar. And he was actually trying to explore the possibility, because he's Pune based, looking at dry districts in Maharashtra or bordering Madhya Pradesh, to actually utilize the wasteland there. And we have calculated we can actually produce as much green hydrogen in India through this route as through the mission, which is trying to produce it to the solar route. This has multiple benefits. A, it's locally produced. You can have decentralized production of green hydrogen. The plants can be very small. It need not be a gigaton plant. It can be, in kilos also, if you want to, or a ton or two also, or megatons if you wish to. Two, you create an income stream for people who work on the wasteland. You're also then restoring the wasteland, through greening. And you're, of course, generating green hydrogen, which is a substitute for other fuel. So, you can multiple benefits, and it's no longer at a pilot stage. The pilot is done. It's actually into an expansion phase. I'll pass on details to Madhav, and WRI can, look at how it can be done to anybody.
Thank you very much. So one last question. I know you have to rush back, but the final question is of finance, right? As we see a lot of these businesses, for them to be able to scale, they need to access, market money. It's very clear they're not going to be able to pay 18% return or give 18% return. Recently we've been hearing a very interesting example from Brazil where BNDES, which is the NABARD equivalent. So BNDES is now exploring giving loans at 5%, and it's asking civil society and philanthropy organizations to create first loss guarantees, which is sort of an approach. So, do you think an approach like this would be interesting to do? Is there how do we create low interest debt? Again, are there government schemes that could be combined to do this? Any thoughts on that?
So, as of now, the simple answer is no, there is none. But I think it's an option worth exploring. This is not very different from the whole business of climate finance, right? What is the issue there, And one of the simple issues is cost of capital is too expensive to make climate-friendly technologies viable. That's the big thing in climate finance. So why are we talking of international capital not flowing to developing countries? Why are we trying to pull in the World Bank and the big donors into it? Forget all the talk. From a pure finance point of view, the cost of capital is too high to make technologies viable. If they were actually commercially viable, you wouldn't need any international finance. Local finance will be adequate to do it. It will happen. That's the law of economics. I guess a similar approach can be tried out in restoration because it's not fundamentally different. There are going to be initial teething bottlenecks which will require some low-cost money investment, which then would make that particular thing, which is, something which is completely non-viable probably will not become viable through that approach. But I suspect there are a lot of borderline cases where all the 3 to 4, 5% reduction in interest rates will make all the difference to the IRR of that particular investment, which then you can use. Now, how do you go about doing it? We'll have to see. It could be a government scheme. It could be, some co-financing with a charity or a trust fund. It could be multiple ways, or the government actually comes in straight away saying that, I do interest subvention. But of course, when government comes in, it will put a lot of conditions. It will be for purpose A, B, C, D, not E, F, G, H, all that. So it can be structured. But what would it need? It would need a quick survey of what the problem is, what the solutions are, what are the solutions which are actually capable of being done at the margins, what are the kind of assistance they need individually, what would be the kind of assistance that would be needed in aggregate. Suppose you want to say 100 million hectares in India are going. I'm seeing the targets. There's a Green India mission, then there's this, what is the other one? Green carbon or whatever.
Bond challenge.
Yeah, green bond, whatever. I'm seeing the numbers they're looking at in terms of seeing the size of the a challenge ahead of you, which is 100 million hectares. I like that figure. It's easy to remember, 100 million hectares. I'm saying I'm doing 12,000 hectares, Green India, I'm doing some 50,000 hectares. It's not even a drop in the ocean. So you actually have to think scale, think big. And that's where a commercial approach, where at the margin you bring in some finance to make it commercially viable, is the best approach. So I think if this entire exercise can be done, and I think WRI could lead it, and NITI is willing to partner with WRI and anybody else in the room. I'm not ruling out anybody. I'm just taking WRI because I'm seeing the name. With TRI, we have, I think, who is here from TRI? Anybody? Raise the hand. Yeah. So I think we have worked with TRI on the Bihar vision, if I'm not wrong. Okay, it's actually, I just saw the report on my table. The vision is ready. So we're willing to partner with anybody to actually first understand the size of the challenge and the size of the help needed. Then we can structure, actually that can be part of the same exercise, structure the intervention. I mean, it will take probably 3 to 4 months to get that done, and then we can set the ball rolling. Is the government going to be interested? Yes. Is going to act just like that? No. We need to do the spade work, groundwork, and I think we can set the ball rolling.
Excellent. We'll take 2 questions from the audience and then we'll close. So 2 questions, if somebody can get the mic. There's one more question. Anybody else? Okay, they're both in the back, so let's take questions.
Backbenchers always ask the most questions.
Sir, I'm Ashish Mandal. I had the opportunity to work with you in Dhar district, so that's different. The question is that you talked about that this wasteland restoration can add 3% GDP, which is really very significant. But anything that you have worked out, like, how much investment that would require to get that delta? Even a back of the envelope kind of calculation.
Truthful answer is no. But I would actually put that broadly, if you see rate of return is something is generally, you would know that even if you get a 6 to 7% rate of return, that's a rate of return which is at the margins. So if you look at that as the rate of return and you want to, get a certain return per annum, which is 2 billion, 2% would require 2% of GDP additional per annum would translate into something like $80 billion. $80 billion, if that's the return you're looking at every year, if that is, say, 8%, that's the return you're getting, then you're talking about $100 billion investment, right? But that's if you're tackling all the 100 million hectares, right? But if you do it, but then we'll have to see. A lot of programs are there, a lot of schemes are there, a lot of convergence can be there. After all, where did when we worked in the field, we didn't get much money from IWDP or DDP or DPAP. You were mentioning Dhar. 90% of the money was actually in Manrega money. In those days, there was no Manrega, so you used the employment assurance scheme money to get these watershed activities done. So I think there's immense scope for convergence at the bottom.
Sure. No, sir, I think you answered my point, but point is like, globally it says that the gap is about 700 billion per annum. That's
I've calculated in front of you 100 for India.
So, yeah, so globally 700
not terribly, different from our size in the world.
The point is we need a plan, we need a framework to move towards that direction.
Absolutely.
That's the point.
Hello, sir. Good afternoon. This is Dr. Rajkumar Hal, the CEO and founder of Ruvenile Biomedical. Sir, how do you measure the impact of restoration? First. Second things, restoration of air pollution could be better for the GDP? Because it's just not the land. Even air also can be a good restoration for health.
So, let's separate the two. Air pollution can lead to a loss of healthy life expectancy, right? So loss in life expectancy is a far more difficult thing to calculate in monetary terms, okay? So if you're going to live 5 years longer because you're breathing bad air, it's far difficult to calculate the monetary impact of that, okay? It leads to all kinds of funny outcomes, because then what happens if you multiply by the per capita income of that individual and the number of years the person lives, a person living in a rich country will have a high monetary value than a lower value on a per annum basis, right? So nobody actually delves into it. You get the point, right? People will look in terms of when they do the Delhi air pollution, whatever. If you look at economic impact, they look at economic impact because of absenteeism at work, healthcare costs, they do that. But actually, fundamentally, human life, and then how do you value life? It's a more difficult thing. For the other one, how do you value the impact of restoration? I think that's one of the important things, and that's what, if anybody works on it, should bring out. We need frameworks. We need frameworks on standards. We need frameworks on measurements. We need to then, we do not have any accounting system for restoration. Just as we have no accounting system for, say, blue economy. There's no accounting system, and MOSPI has created a committee to measure what is the potential GDP of the blue economy that is there. We know fishermen, fishing, we know odds, we don't know in totality. I think we can do that here. If it's going to sequester carbon, typically I'm saying, and suppose you're going to get what additional gigaton out of the way per annum. Okay, what would be an alternate in mitigation? And that cost could then be the cost, the benefit of restoration. So we'll have to find methodologies, and I think that could be a separate piece of work, right?
Thank you very much. Sorry, he really has to leave. Thank you very much for your time, and really a big round of applause.
So, thank you very much, Madhav. Last word. I'd like WRI to take the lead. Anybody here from the think tank, NGO world, wants to partner on this? NITI signs a lot of SOI, statements of intent, with what we call development partners. Anybody want to work in aspirational districts, blocks? Be in touch with Madhav. Maybe WRI can compile a list of 1, 2, 5, 10, whatever, organizations which are interested, and then we'll carry this forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So I'll just tell them what it's about. Thank you so much, sir, for your perspectives and your time. We'd also just like to take this opportunity, now that we have Mr. Subrahmanyam on stage, to launch our team's newest working paper. This is an extensive and arduous exercise. We've done a systematic literature review of over 350 items of literature on the linkages between land restoration and climate action.
I'll invite Raghav and Ruchika to also join our esteemed guests on stage to launch the paper. And we have a small token of appreciation for our speaker.
Thank you so much, Mr. Subrahmanyam and Madhav, for this wonderful conversation, very insightful. And thank you for helping us transition into the next presentation. This is about a presentation about the paper that we just released. We hope it will be interesting and useful for the community. This is, like I mentioned, this is the product of, This is the product of a few years of labor, and many colleagues participated in this from our team. I'll take you briefly through this, and then we can maybe have some time for questions. Please bear with me. This is not a very interesting presentation because it's based on a lot of data and information and numbers, and I'm glad that we have these very beautiful backdrops on either side. Maybe you can focus on those if it gets too meandering. So this is just a little bit of background. It might not be very relevant here. So just to start off with, the word restoration, as has been discussed in previous sessions, is a word that, again, it blends kind of almost combines with other pre-existing concepts like watershed restoration, conservation, and things like that. So just a little bit of history about the concept of restoration as the word came about and to be used in the practice that it is. I think the kind of, it emerged from this critique of conservation that became popular and mainstream in the 2000s, of how conservation was, and a valid critique of how conservation was leaving people off the map. And so the concept of restoration kind of came up as a correction and to address this critique. So the definition that WWF and IUCN first came up with for restoration, forest landscape restoration in the year 2000, was that it is a planned process that aims to regain ecological integrity and enhance human well-being in deforested or degraded landscapes. For our own work, and it's generally in practice in India, we've moved away from forest landscapes exclusively and started talking more about mosaic landscapes. In WRI's own work, as well, we've also adapted, I think, the definition from FLR, but kind of applied it to multifunctional, multi-use mosaic landscapes. And that's generally what we understand and mean by landscape restoration. So in this review, what we attempted to address were these two main questions. We were broadly looking at the synergies and the linkages that exist between landscape restoration and climate mitigation and adaptation. And the questions that we came up with were these. We thought that these would kind of cover the problems and issues that we were looking at. The first question was, what are the multiple benefits achieved through different restoration interventions in India that support climate mitigation and or adaptation? I'll just say climate action from now on. I won't say mitigation or adaptation, but that's what I'll mean. And what enabling conditions support the flow of mitigation and adaptation benefits? So to answer these questions, we relied on the IUFRO framework. This is an international framework developed by Stanturf et al. In the 2015 paper. This framework focuses on three major aspects, which we found useful to also structure our analysis and adapt a little bit of modification. The first part of this framework to answer these questions addresses the biophysical characteristics of whatever literature and information we're looking at. So through this, we use this kind of guidance to capture details of different restorations, interventions, and techniques that kind of comprise this spectrum that we call restoration. The second part of this framework was the benefits section. Here, it's kind of benefits in terms of the ecosystem service benefits that are derived from restoration activities. These, again, they're not categorized exactly as the ecosystem service categorization of the IPBES framework, but it's a little more disaggregated than that, and we found it very useful. And the last piece of this framework is enabling conditions, the enabling conditions piece, which we kind of used to categorize and analyze the various enabling conditions that were coming out from our review. These are just small snapshots. Anyone familiar with literature reviews will probably be familiar with diagrams like this. On the left is a Prisma diagram of how we conducted our search and review process. And on the right side is a table of keywords. For anyone who's not familiar, systematic literature reviews are explicit, reproducible methods to synthesize and analyze bodies of literature for inferences that are not possible to draw from a few papers alone. There are many approaches for conducting systematic literature reviews. The one that we found most appropriate to our study was the PSALSAR approach. PSALSAR is an acronym, stands for Protocol, Search, Appraisal, Synthesis, Analysis, and Reporting of Results. So this is a relatively recent framework. We found it very comprehensive and used it for this paper. The diagram on the left shows kind of the process of selection and screening of papers. This is a PRISMA flowchart. PRISMA is another acronym. It's called Preferred Reporting Items in Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analyses. So I'll just spend 1 minute on just explaining the methodology that we employed. So we kind of did a database search. We mostly use Science Direct and then also Google Scholar, and shortlisted papers based on the keywords on the right. We used search strings with those keywords, different combinations using Boolean operators. And from the initial hits, we then screened the title, abstracts, and keywords of articles and retained the relevant ones. Relevant ones in the sense that they're the ones discussing all three themes: mitigation, adaptation, or adaptation, and restoration. The final selections then we were made after reviewing the entire manuscripts of papers. We also used snowballing, Google searches, and site visits, website visits, and physical site visits to different places to gather literature that was not accessible through searches alone. So a lot of grey literature was incorporated through this, to these methods. As part of this grey literature, we incorporated key technical reports, we incorporated working papers, conference proceedings, policy papers, and also papers from research institutes that are relevant in the area, as well as forest working plans. So coming to our findings, this is kind of encapsulates a lot of our findings. So these are the various kinds of linkages that we found between landscape restoration and mitigation and adaptation. It's a little bit not self-explanatory, so I'll try and break it down a little bit. The blue section, which is the largest section, is the bulk of our literature showed linkages between, explicit linkages between landscape restoration on one hand and climate change mitigation on the other hand. So that's 26%, but talked about mitigation without adaptation. Mitigation generally was talked about explicitly in 69% of our literature, which is a big which is a big portion of it, and I guess it's easy to understand that the kind of the easiest relationship to draw in literature was the relationship between carbon sequestration and landscape restoration. But we also saw what was interesting was that there seems to be, as we'll also discuss and we'll see subsequently, there's a growing attentiveness to restoration beyond just classical interventions such as afforestation, reforestation, or even agroforestry, which has by now become a conventional restoration technique. So the more interesting part, and this was also touched upon briefly by Mr. Subrahmanyam, is the kind of slightly more nebulous relationships that exist between restoration and adaptation, slightly harder to draw out. A total of 263 papers in our review, a substantial portion, did bring out the potential of adaptation from restoration, which is something that we all understand, but it's difficult to bring out always in studies. There were a significant number of studies that did bring this relationship out successfully. 36% of our papers explicitly noted the linkages between adaptation and restoration, and they were implied in a further 38%. About 74% of our papers were talking about adaptation, whether explicitly or implicitly. This adaptation was mostly through the enhanced flow of provisioning services, and fuel, wood, fodder, and generally increased ecosystem resilience through better soil, etc. Another interesting thing that came out was the increasing, overwhelmingly present attention to agroforestry as a restoration intervention. This graph shows the research interest in agroforestry by year. And you can see there's an upward trend in the number of publications and reports that talked about agroforestry. Sorry. Yeah, as part of our enabling conditions, we found that local community-led, community-sensitive, and socio-culturally attentive implementation was the most ubiquitous enabling condition for a successful restoration project or intervention. And this is also reflected in the recognition in literature. This is something, again, we understand through practice, but it was very interesting to see it reflected in the literature as well. And then you can also, this graph also represents the recognition of, again, community-led, meaningful community participation in restoration as a key enabling factor in these projects and studies. Apologies, this is not supposed to be readable. It's not. It's just illustrative figure. A more clear figure can be found in our the paper copy, again available on our website. But this just shows the gamut, the spectrum of the various kinds of interventions and techniques that fall within restoration, which ranges from your conventional techniques on the top, like ANR, afforestation, deforestation, to managing wildfires, to creating microclimate refugia for endangered species. Again, another finding from our paper, fairly clear, afforestation and deforestation is still one of the most studied and talked about after agroforestry restoration interventions, and the graph kind of reflects the interest. The tapering off you see towards the end in all of the graphs is not outlier, it's just this is a decadal analysis, and the last graph only represents the 4 years of this present decade. The second section of our framework, as I mentioned earlier, was capturing the benefits. So we use this framework. This is an illustration of the larger figure that's present in the paper of our analysis on the various benefits that are captured through restoration projects. Some of these indicators indicate adaptation and mitigation. Some of them indicate only adaptation. Some of them indicate only mitigation. But this is generally how we chose to present them. Again, I'm not going into too much detail just to make it less boring than it already is, but please do have a look at our paper to see these findings and in more context. We also found about 25 to 26 papers for mangrove restoration, mixed bioenergy plantations, and other kinds of newer, less conventional restoration techniques that are also becoming more popular and more current as I think the the practice and the discourse evolves. Coming to the last piece, our enabling conditions piece, we broadly found enabling conditions fitting into four buckets: social, ecological, economic, and institutional. So recent reviews, this was not the first review to indicate this, but recent other reviews of global literature, not in India, but global literature, have identified foregrounding the voices and needs of local and native populations as critical to successful restoration projects, and that was reflected in Indian literature as well. So ensuring the participation and obtaining the prior informed consent of all local communities featured as a critical enabler in over 27% of the papers in our review. And 17% of our reviewed papers explicitly spoke to women's involvement as a critical feature of community participation, 17% of 355 papers, dating back from 1990. Establishing clear modalities for use rights and sharing of benefits also emerged as a critical enabling condition, again in 18% of the literature. We saw a proliferation of critiques since the 2010s also. So we also saw a nuance emerging in the way that communities are involved in restoration. So since the 2010s, there was a proliferation of critiques against programs like the GFM program that were intended to be participatory, but over time their implementation and the learnings from them showed that there were better ways to involve communities. And that the meanings of participatory democracy in these contexts also are changing and they're becoming more nuanced. We also found that there were very few, 9 items of literature that were discussing tenurial rights and tenurial security as a critical condition of restoration. While we understand that it is critical and important, it's not always something that's present in scientific literature or approached in studies. But we found that there were 9 items of literature, scientific literature, that talked about tenurial security as a critical enabling condition. However, 8 of these 9 were published after 2013. So it's a recent trend to start voicing these concerns in scientific literature, and hopefully a growing trend. Ecological conditions, I'll just go over these very briefly, but they're in a little more detail in the paper. Ecological enabling conditions include the importance of selecting the right species for certain contexts. So maybe the species of trees were appropriate, fruit trees were appropriate, timber trees were appropriate, grasses were appropriate. Economic and market conditions were again stressed as very important to the establishing of adequate opportunities for the people who are involved in restoration. And institutional conditions, the importance of stakeholders like NGOs, like finance institutions, extension service providers, and research institutions that, as Mr. Subrahmanyam also mentioned in his talk, play that critical kind of middleman, organizing, facilitating role, which includes capacity building as well. So we also found gaps and challenges that were kind of recurring in the literature to successful restoration for climate action. The first challenge that was kind of jumping out was the challenges related to measurement and methodology, specifically the measurement of carbon. This has been noted as a specific challenge in multiple kind of papers across fields: agroforestry, agricultural studies, mangrove system studies, biodiversity studies in India. And the lack of long-term landscape level and multivariate studies as well as something that was also noted as something that's hindering the actual understanding of how restoration works. And again, I don't need to go on about the logistical and cost difficulties with all of these things. The second challenge was institutional and policy challenges. The limited investment and financial support, again, the points which have been raised earlier today, contradictions in government directives and capacity for data gathering, as well as the mismatches between kind of data systems and knowledge systems are constraints impeding agroforestry adoption and restoration generally as well in India. A disproportionate lack of focus on women as well and other marginalized groups has been noted again in many papers as a socio-economic challenge, and something which is also connected to the lack of access to global capital, because the people actually doing restoration are then not meaningfully being able to access the capital for it. Yeah, so just this is the last slide. I won't keep you here any longer. So just a few conclusions which to summarize some of our findings from the rest of the presentation. But what we found, something to kind of be mindful of going forward, is, the studies that exist, we found the gaps that exist are perhaps, in the engagement with the critiques. That right now, I mean, all of us are aware of the critiques of projects. I mean, this has been presented as a paper, but these are things that I think most of us are aware about just through our work and experience. But a deeper dive into the critiques that we came across in terms of the models that work, that involve communities, to understand which models work, which models are successful, what kind of rights and what kind of tenurial securities are actually required to do successful work, is something that we think the general body of restoration scholarship in India would benefit from. And the other important thing we see that seemed to be jumping out from this study as well was that contextualized and inclusive MEL frameworks that disaggregate and monitor impacts based on whether marginalized backgrounds, incorporating intersectionalities, which are something that, I mean, although we started incorporating gender and caste and other things, intersectionalities are something that are still missing from MEL frameworks. And thank you so much. I know I've gone over time. Thank you for your patience. And thank you for being here for the launch of our paper. We hope you will read it and find it useful. Thank you.